Minister Teo, other honorable participants, experts, colleagues, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure to be the part of this important discussion today and this week for what I am certain will be an interesting and productive series of discussions on issues of human capital. Building and benefiting from a valued and productive workforce will be so important in shaping both the response to COVID-19 and, perhaps more importantly, the direction of a future of work that is human-centered and respectful of the principles of social justice. I would like to extend my thanks to the organizers for inviting me as representative of the ILO and for giving us the opportunity to share our perspective on how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted and will continue to impact the labor market in the Asia-Pacific region. I hope that the information to follow will help to set the scene for the discussion in the remaining sessions. What I hope that I will convey is the sense of urgency to react to this crisis in a way that reshuffles political agendas, put many of the social policies needed to generate a human-centered future of work on the top of priority lists and well represented in government budgets. Most governments in the region now are making heroic efforts in their investment to support workers and enterprises to get through these hard times. My fear is that as soon as recovery starts, that the surge of investments in the social programs will decrease again. That is not the way forward for sustainable development. Only when human capital and well-being are persistently put at the front of national agendas, and when all areas of governments, working closely with workers and employers organizations, the private sector and development partners, stand ready to build a transformative social agenda, will we make progress towards building the resilient societies that our crisis-prone world now calls for. But let me get back to the COVID-19 labor market impact. The COVID-19 virus has turned the world upside down. The region has weathered economic and health crises before, but in some ways, this crisis is proving to be unique. One thing that makes the crisis different has been both the depth and breadth of national lockdowns periods that have brought economic activity in many countries to a standstill. The timing and severity of lockdowns has varied, but even at the beginning of this month, 1/3 of the world's workers were living in countries with some degree of lockdown. And even as lockdowns eased, surviving enterprises and workers face uncertainties, which in turn impacts negatively on consumption and investment behavior. Nearly all of the large economies in the region, including Singapore, are now in recession. Unfortunately, we do not know how long it will take for economies to bounce back. This economic chaos has a devastating impact on workers and enterprises, which shows up with the unprecedented losses of working hours that we are seeing. In the Asia-Pacific region, the total hours worked in the second quarter measured by the ILO were 15.2% lower than in the fourth quarter of 2019. This is equivalent to a loss of 265 million full-time jobs. Third quarter working hour losses are expected to be 10.7% lower, which is equal to a loss of 185 million full-time jobs. Most of the working hours lost manifest through workers that are asked to work fewer hours per week or not to work at all for a period of time. These people remain employed. The alternative would be for the enterprises to let them go entirely, so they become unemployed or inactive. It is good news that so many workers have been able to keep their jobs, and this is thanks to, in part, to the existence of labor laws in countries that require enterprises to retain workers if at all possible. A good example is Singapore's tripartite advisory on managing excess manpower and responsible retrenchment, which has helped to save a lot of jobs. Government assistance programs have helped enterprises to offset some of the cost retaining employees through wage subsidies, loans, tax deferrals, and so on. It is reassuring to see that countries with labor laws and with a capacity to support enterprises are showing some positive results at saving jobs. But we also need to be realistic and recognize that the longer demand remains down, the more difficult it will be for enterprises to survive. And we should also not forget that micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises are being especially hard hit. Some surveys show that small enterprises do not receive the same level of government support as large enterprises, which is an oversight that many governments are struggling to cope with. So, working hour losses are first and foremost as a signal of crisis impact. There are other effects as well. What we are finding is that despite the efforts of some enterprises to retain workers, in the second quarter data available now for a handful of countries, we see a decline in employment and an increase in unemployment and persons outside the labor force. Always, there are more people exiting the labor market than to unemployment, which reminds us that it does not make sense to measure this crisis impact in terms of unemployment alone. Unfortunately, past crises have shown us that it is more challenging to activate persons who fall outside the labor market than to reactivate persons who fall into unemployment. The crisis is affecting some subgroups of the population particularly hard, such as migrants, young people, and women. We have seen clearly in the countries with available data that women are being disproportionately affected. More women than men lost their jobs, more women moved into inactivity, and more women became unemployed. And these are just the measurable consequences. We also hear reports of increased gender-based violence as households feel the stress of forced confinement. And school closures have increased the burden of unpaid care work, which falls heavily on the shoulders of women. In totality, the impact of this crisis on women threatens to overturn the years of progress that some countries have made towards improved labor market outcomes for women and reduced gender inequalities. As for young people, they are faced with the trilemma of disrupted education and training, early and higher degrees of employment loss, and school-to-work transition that will be long and difficult as they try to begin their working lives during a period of economic downturn. Again, we know from past crises that there is a potential scarring effect associated to young people who enter labor markets during economic crisis. Migrant workers, which offer the much-needed hard labor in this region, are also facing especially dire consequences. Many of them are excluded from the emergency social protection measures put in place by governments, leaving millions of them without any income. With lost working hours comes significant losses in labor income. The ILO 6th edition monitor that was released last week estimated a labor income decline of 9.9% in the Asia-Pacific region in the first 3 quarters of 2020. This is equivalent to a 3.4% loss in GDP. That may sound like an impressive statistics, but I am not sure that it fully captures the gravity of what is happening on the ground. Millions of people in our region will soon be reaching the end of their household savings and are facing the most fearful situation of not being able to put food on the table for their families. These people will need urgent assistance to get back on their feet. Let me conclude in general terms that workers and enterprises and all that depend on them are suffering in this region and across the globe, we continue to feel the devastating impacts of the pandemic on jobs and labor income. And unfortunately, we think that the disruption in the labor market will persist well into 2021. All of the labor market consequences that I have mentioned have profound adverse implications for achieving the sustainable development goals of the 2030 agenda. In response to the crisis, governments are already taking unprecedented actions. Those who can are implementing extraordinary measures to offset the temporary drops in income and aggregate demand, ensure adequate levels of social protection, and stabilize credit and financial markets. Yet, the weaknesses of labor market institutions in many countries of the region have hampered the delivery and effectiveness of policy responses and magnified the existing gaps. For instance, most social protection systems do not provide assistance to workers in the informal economy, and most public employment services are not ready to cope with a surge in demand for job placement services. The weaknesses in labor market institutions and their capacity to react quickly in support of workers and enterprises are magnified during times of crisis, which is exactly why these are the areas where we need to concentrate national attention for increased investment for the future. Before concluding my presentation, let me highlight some of the policy areas that ILO feels will be important to supporting recovery and crisis resilience. First, comprehensive social protection systems are required not only to tackle underlying issues of poverty and inequality, but as an essential element to boost aggregate demand and support the economy to bounce back. Second, the pandemic has elevated the importance of building skills systems that prepare workers to be agile and mobile in the face of shocks. This theme will be picked up over the course of this conference, and I hope that there will be some consensus built up and international cooperation to support enterprises and promote labor productivity. Fourth, we will need to upgrade occupational safety and health measures and a renewed commitment to enforcing them. Regardless of the policy measure and where it fits on the national recovery agenda, I hope that it will be framed through a setting of social dialogue. It has become a commonplace phrase that the new normal awaits us after the battle against COVID-19 is won. I am certain that together we can find solidarity and relenting commitment to protect everyone during this trying period and take up the task of building a resilient future of work. Forums like these are our opportunity to learn from each other and come together around common goals. I look forward to engaging with you further. Thank you.